Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Susanna Blume, the Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS. And today we're doing a webinar on defense management reform. Joining me are Peter Levine and Bob Work, and thanks to you both very much for being here today.
Glad to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Susanna.
Yep. Great to be here, Susanna.
Thanks. So after leaving the Pentagon in January of 2017, Peter started working on a book, Defense Management Reform: How to Make the Pentagon Work Better and Cost Less. And this book came out just a few months ago, and that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. And, Peter has spent his entire career looking at kind of defense management reform issues from a lot of different angles. First on the Hill as the SASC staff director, then at the Pentagon as the Deputy Chief Management Officer, and then later as the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, and now as a senior fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis. And Bob, of course, was the senior most management official in DoD as the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the end of the Obama administration. So we've got two of the most expert people around on this topic joining us today. But before we dive into the substance, I want to just run through a couple admin notes. This conversation is public, it's live streamed, and will be recorded, and we will post the video after the conclusion of the event. We're going to reserve about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the session to take questions from our Zoom audience. So to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And please note that we will not be taking anonymous questions, so you have to identify yourself by name in order to get an answer. And so with those few admin notes taken care of, Peter, I'd like to invite you to make a couple opening remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you, Susanna. Thank you and CNAS for putting on this event. And I'm delighted to be here with both you and Bob Work, who are, I consider to be two good friends and are certainly two really fine public servants. Let me begin by saying that we too often suffer from a lack of institutional memory at the top levels of our government. We have senior political appointees in any administration who typically average around 2 years before they leave. And as we know, in recent years, the turnover seems to have gotten even faster. Senior military officers are appointed for limited terms, so we can only expect to have them in the top positions for about 4 years. And every new administration, I think you were just saying this, Bob, every new administration, every new leadership seems to come in with its own agenda, thinking that the world began with them. This is not just a problem in the executive branch. On Capitol Hill, we have members of Congress who stay for decades, but we also have term limits that result in quick turnover of committee chairs. During the 24 years since I joined the Senate Armed Services Committee staff, the House Armed Services Committee has had 8 different chairmen, so that's an average of about 3 years each. Committee staff also tend to stay for about 2 or 3 years. The Senate Armed Services Committee staff did much better. But when I left the SASC, my successor on working on acquisition policy issues informed me after he'd been there for less than a year that he was now the senior most experienced official, most experienced Senate staffer or Senate or House staffer in that area after about a year. When I was on Capitol Hill, I tried to fill some of the gap in institutional knowledge by sharing my experience with my colleagues. And I really believe that the perspective that I gained in my years on Capitol Hill benefited me when I came to the Pentagon and was serving there. The book that I've written is in some sense an effort to pass on more broadly to others some of my institutional experience. Most of the book is focused on 3 case studies in defense management reform, civilian personnel reform, acquisition reform, and financial management reform. In each of these areas, it provides about a 30 to 40 year history of DoD reform efforts, which I think provides a helpful perspective on what went before. The book also tries to draw some general lessons for reform efforts in general. Why do some efforts at reform work and others fail, or at least some work better than others? And for those who are interested but find it too tall of an order to read the entire book, I have a couple of suggestions. One is buy the book anyway. You don't have to read the book. You don't have to read the whole thing. Nobody's going to test you. And second, you can cheat by reading my War on the Rocks article, in which I distilled the whole thing down to 10 simple words, for 10 simple rules for what works and what doesn't work. Those rules may seem obvious, but it's amazing how many senior people at the Pentagon or on Capitol Hill or reform advocates don't seem to get them, and how many reform efforts have fallen short as a result. So with that, I would be delighted to turn it back over to you, Susanna, and to take any questions that you or Bob have for me.
Thanks, Peter. So just a reminder to the audience, you can start populating that Q&A function at any time, and then we'll turn our attention to your questions at the end. So, feel free to just drop them right in there as we go along. But I'll kick us off here. Peter, you open your book with an anecdote about a certain study by the Defense Business Board that I think all three of us remember well. And I was wondering if you could tell us about that study, what the flaws were, and then we'll go to Bob for his reflections and recollections of that series of events.
Well, first, I think I have to apologize to Bob for reminding him about this at all. It wasn't, I gather, his favorite incident during the time that we were serving at the Pentagon. But about the time I was nominated to serve as Deputy Chief Management Officer, the Defense Business Board came out with a study saying the department could save about $125 billion by cutting wasteful overhead in 6 core business processes. That later became controversial when Bob Woodward wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that the chairman of the DBB had been fired and the report was buried because the department didn't want to admit that it was wasting that much money. Now, I think Secretary Work pointed out at the time that the report had been publicly available during the entire time when Woodward said it was buried. What nobody really wanted to say, and because it's not really politic to say it, is that it really wasn't a very good report in the first place. There was no substantive basis for the projected savings in the report. What the DBB did was it characterized a budget and said, if you cut that budget by X%, you'll save this much money. It didn't tell you how to cut the budget by that much. It didn't tell you what different things you were going to do. It didn't offer any new agenda items that the department could pursue that it wasn't already pursuing before. So there was really no formula that the department could follow to achieve those savings other than cutting the budget and hoping for the best. I talk about the study in the introduction of my book as a launching point for explaining how hard defense management reform is, that cutting the budgets is necessary at times, but it doesn't actually reform anything. If you want to improve the way the department works, you really have to dig into the details of programs, operations, and organizations and figure out how you can run them better.
Thanks, Peter. Bob, any words of wisdom to add on this episode?
Well, as Peter said, this wasn't my favorite episode as the Deputy Secretary. I was told before I came in, I said, the last thing you ever want to do is be on the front page of the Washington Post. He said, nothing ever good happens from that. And in this case, it was above the fold, page 1, written by Bob Woodward, and basically saying Bob Work has hidden $125 billion. It was not a great time. I agree with Peter. It's interesting that report turned out to be very consequential in different ways than the heads of the DBB thought at the time. As Peter said, they said, look, if you can cut your overhead, the number of people in the department by 7%, you're going to save a lot of money. And we said, gosh, we never thought of that, but they never really told us other than set up little groups and study it and come up with things. They didn't tell us how we would pick and choose and change the processes of the department to get down to the 7% cut that they were talking about. The other thing they recommended was that we should recompete every single contract in the Department of Defense. There was no basis for the recompete, but if we did, they were certain we would be able to save some money. Now, they had a whole bunch of other ideas that turned out to be good. We had never really defined the core business processes of the department formally, and this report did that for us. And essentially what it said is these are the cross-functional processes that span across the department. So in that regard, it was really good. And the other thing it told us, and Peter will remember this, is they say, look, your financial accounting is pretty good, but your cost accounting, you don't know the cost of doing business. So as a result of that, we started a cost accounting process, which started to illuminate. So when people think about that report, from the Department of Defense, I specifically found it very, very helpful. But like I said, it's never good to be the subject of a Bob Woodward report on the first page above the fold in the Washington Post that says, look, you're incompetent and you can't find this money.
Another thing that we did following that report, Bob, is we asked the DBB to go back and look at some of the 6 core business processes more specifically and focus in and tell us what we should look at to try to gain some savings. I remember they looked at logistics, which they had projected for tens of billions of dollars of savings, and came back and said, we really didn't find much here that you can do differently. They looked at real estate, on the other hand, and they did come back with some good proposals. So it varied from area to area, but it was clear there wasn't all that easy money that the Washington Post article implied.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that there was actually quite a lot of goodness in this report. I think the primary risk that this episode highlights is of announcing, huge savings before you have actually found them. And I feel like that's a trap that I've watched many different defense officials fall into, over the years, irrespective of party affiliation or anything else.
Yeah.
Let me just, Susanna, you're exactly right. I think most of the listeners may know this, but what happens is the Secretary of Defense would come in and say, look, I want to achieve 10% savings in overhead. And it takes a while to, generate the savings from whatever reform you're trying to do. In fact, sometimes it costs money to generate the savings up front. But what you have to do from a budgetary perspective is put in what is called a negative wedge. So you're putting in the 10% savings each year in your program before you have identified the exact savings. And so therefore, two years down the line, there's a little bogey in the budget that says, hey, here's this $10 billion you need to account for. And if you haven't generated the savings, you have to go back into the program and say, well, we're going to have to cut a couple F-35s. We're going to have to not buy another LCS. We're going to have to, cut down on O&M. So the way that the department generally does it is, I'm going to cut you 10%, become more efficient. I don't know if Peter agrees with this or not, but that's the general way that Congress and senior leaders seem to approach this problem.
I actually have a second article that I published in War on the Rocks, which is precisely on this subject about the role of savings in management reform. And I take the same point of view as Bob, not surprisingly, which is that savings goals play an important role, in part because it's often the only way to kickstart the department to actually look seriously at cutting things. There are too many ways that if you send somebody out without a savings goal, they can come back and justify everything they're spending and say they need more. And if you want to get them focused on prioritization and saying what they can cut and efficiency and what they can do differently, you almost have to give them some kind of target. But it's really important, and this is the other conclusion I reach in the article, it's really important that that target be realistic and based on some look at what is actually possible to do and what steps you can practically take to achieve it. Because if you have these kinds of goals that we've seen recently, occasionally the more politically driven goals where somebody says we're going to cut 25% out of the fourth estate or something like that, or 25% out of core business practices in a year where it's completely not feasible, then you're setting yourself up for failure.
So on that same topic, we've kind of gone through several things that are not good ways to approach business reform. Peter, in your book, you detail a couple like really critical elements of successful reform efforts. And could you step us through those and maybe give us a couple examples of where you've really seen those in action?
Sure. I don't have time to go through all the 10 rules that I give in my article, but boiling it down, I'd say the key is engage leadership that focuses on a specific set of problems, digs in to really understand them, and then remains committed to driving a solution all the way through implementation. So the gold standard for defense reform, defense management reform, I believe, is still Goldwater Nichols. And one of the reasons that that was so successful, beyond the fact that it had top-level attention from Congress over a period of a decade, is that it started with a well-defined problem, a series of operational failures by the U.S. military. It identified a root cause, the inability of the military services to function as a joint force, and it focused like a laser beam on addressing that root cause. So I've heard some of the authors of the Goldwater Nichols say, we were really good at defense management reform. If we'd only taken on more different things, we could have solved the whole thing. And my response to that is, you're exactly wrong. The reason you were successful is that you didn't take on more. You focused on jointness. You solved one problem. You didn't try to solve the whole world. One piece of legislation that I'm particularly proud of in my Capitol Hill career, the Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act, not as monumental as Goldwater Nichols, but it took the same approach. It focused on a specific problem, out of control cost overruns on major weapons platforms. It identified a root cause, the lack of disciplined decision making at the front end of programs, and it focused like a laser beam on addressing that root cause. I would add that there's another element to that success, and I meant, which is that we then had, that's legislation, and one of my rules is a particularly nice one coming from somebody who served on Capitol Hill staff for so long. Legislation alone doesn't solve anything. So WSARA alone wasn't going to solve anything. It was key then that we had leaders in the Department of Defense, and specifically Ash Carter and Frank Kendall, who took ownership of that and drove it home, so that it wasn't just a piece of legislation that sat on the shelf, but something that took on a real life. So that's, to me, what it takes to implement successful reform in the department.
So I think there are a couple of things in there that I want to dive a little bit deeper on. And the first is this kind of consistent theme of, the importance of prioritizing and focusing on a finite number of problems at any given time. Can you talk to us a little bit more about, what happens when that doesn't occur? And I mean, there's a good example in the book as well.
Well, there are any number of good examples, but and I don't think when I was in Capitol Hill, I necessarily appreciated how the sheer number of legislative provisions that an NDAA includes undermines their effectiveness. One of the things that legislation can do for the department, and I think it serves an important role, is to catalyze the department, to move the department up to action. The way you do that is by helping set the department's priorities, calling attention to problems. But if you call attention to every problem, big and small, then there isn't a whole lot of prioritization in there. A non-legislative example that I've looked at that I don't remember if this particular one is in the book, but when I was on Capitol Hill, we looked at incentive fees on contracts, and we discovered that the government, were trying to incentivize so many different things that we'd lost track of the purpose of acquisition programs, that a contractor had incentives for should have incentives for being responsive and answering their mail and helping out the contracting officer and hiring the right kinds of people and all these different things, and they could get their full incentive fee when they weren't actually performing what they were supposed to on the contract. That's what happens if you try to load too many things on at the same time. In terms of management reform, the same overload kind of thing can happen. The senior officials in the department have a limited bandwidth. They have a lot of things that they have to do. Bob, I think it was you who said that your inbox used to grow by 6 feet a day, if I remember it. I'd heard that about the deputy secretary's inbox at any rate. That is a tremendous demand function. That means that there's a limited number of issues that you can take on and personalize and really weigh into. And that kind of personal engagement is what is required for effective defense management reform. So if you expect that you're going to take on 6 or 8 or 10 major areas of defense management reform at the same time and put a single official in charge of them, which was the congressional vision for the chief management officer when they created it, I don't think that's realistic. You have to choose 1 or 2 so that you can really focus within the bandwidth of what somebody can do and make progress on those issues.
So Bob, as one of those, really engaged leaders on management reform issues, do you have any kind of thoughts or reflections on what Peter's just gone over?
No, I agree with Peter totally. The other thing that I was constantly frustrated with is Congress has told the department many times, look, we want you to be more innovative. We want you to push the boundaries. We want you to learn fast and fail fast. And it appeared to me that Congress would test a legislative, administrative proposal, and then they would decide a year later, hey, this isn't working the way we thought, so we're going to change it. And I'm thinking, I wanted to ask Peter about this. You know, first it was the DCMO and the Deputy Chief Management Officer working directly for the Deputy Secretary. Then Congress said, no, this is working like we wanted. We're going to have a Chief Management Officer. And, you know, now Congress is saying, no, the Chief Management Officer didn't work the way we want, and they're saying for it to go away. I can't tell you how difficult it is for the department to keep up with the constant changing in legislation and telling us how to organize. And there's a great, you can't legislate. I think it's, Peter, it's one of your 10 rules. You can't legislate reform. You have to actually do the hard work. I don't know, you say it a lot more pithily than that. But I was just wondering on what Peter thinks about this, on the constant kind of, hey, let's learn fast and fail fast. That's not the way you're ever going to get any type of a consistent reform effort in the department.
So I think learn fast and fail fast is a message that Congress has been sending on advanced R&D, and yes, that area. And I think it makes sense in that area. I think that there are areas where we want to test things in the areas of technology and try things, and if we fail, move on before we plunge a whole lot of money into a major weapon system. When it comes to the management and structure of the Department of Defense, though, I absolutely agree with Bob. There's too much dancing around and changing organization, and you have to give an organization an opportunity to work. I wasn't a great fan of promoting the DCMO to CMO, making him nominally the third highest ranking official in the department. I think that there's always been something of a mismatch between the expectations for that office and the capacity of the office. But I wish the Congress would just settle. And if they're going to abolish the office now, as it appears they will, I hope they'll let the department come up with an alternative approach and stick with that approach for a while, because it's important to have consistency of management, and just shuffling the deck chairs becomes problematic. I had heard that when the decision was made to split the Undersecretary for AT&L into two undersecretaries, ANS and R&E, we basically lost at least a year of work, because the first year after that happened was all spent by those two offices on dividing up responsibilities and deciding who got what and how they were going to do it. You can do that once if it's important, but you sure don't want to do it twice in 3 years or 3 times in 5 years, because you can't. It's bad enough to lose 1 year, but you can't keep repeating that experience.
Yeah, you know, Peter, sticking with that theme for a minute, I think the quote from the book is, good management is impossible to legislate. Right. And I think that there is a lot of, you know, rearranging of the org chart goes on. And I'm wondering, you know, what your view is, like, how much of successful management is just hiring the right people, and how much of it is actually having the right processes and structures in place? You know, can the right people compensate for poor process? Can poor process compensate for not having the right people in place? You know, how do those dynamics work?
It's my belief that good leaders who have to work with an ineffective process or structure are still going to produce much better results than ineffective leaders working in a good organization. Of course, one of the things that good leaders can do is they can improve processes and structures. So, but again, if you don't have engaged leadership that takes the time to understand a problem and work it through and remain in charge and stick with it, you're not going to accomplish much, at least in the management reform area. There is a tendency sometimes to think you can delegate In the Department of Defense, if you delegate things down too far, you get least common denominator solutions, which result in no action at all. And so this is one of the reasons why bandwidth is so important and prioritization is so important. Having the senior leaders remain engaged is the key to success in this area, in my view. And that's where there is no substitute for a good leader.
Can we actually take a half a step back, Peter? And I wonder, how did your views on defense management reform change between your time on the Hill and your time in the Pentagon, right? Did your thinking about how to approach it, evolve or change at all in that shift?
Well, if you go to my 10 rules on management reform, you'll see that one of those rules is that legislation alone doesn't solve anything. I hope I understood that when I was on Capitol Hill, but I certainly came to understand it a lot better when I came to the department. You see members of Congress pass a law and say and wave the flag saying we solved this problem, and to which my response is, well, if legislation alone could solve things, we wouldn't have cost overruns on defense contracts. I mean, you can legislate. That doesn't do it. You need to have the leadership. You need to have the management on the department side that actually carries things through. And when you pass legislation, that isn't the end of the race. That's the beginning of the race. The other thing we've already talked about, which is understanding how the sheer number of legislative provisions that we pass makes a difference, and that if you really want to impact the way the department works, it's far more important to have quality and focus and priority than it is to have quantity in your legislation.
Boy, that's Susanna, if I could jump in, that resonates so much to me. The sheer size of the NDAA, Peter, is daunting now. I think they're like 1,500 pages, and there is so much in the NDAA that what you do, in my view, what it does is it causes the entire department to focus inward on trying to sort through all of the different things that Congress has told us to do. And I always got a sense that, look, we're not really headed anywhere. We're like, we're just making a lot of dust as we move, or we're like a duck on the water. Man, the length of the NDAA has really gotten out of control. What do you think about this?
So first, yes, if I look just at acquisition provisions, which I handled over a period of several decades, starting before I was on the Armed Service Committee staff, and then during the 20 years or so I was on the Armed Service Committee staff. In the early 1980s, there was rarely an acquisition provision in more than one or two acquisition provisions in an NDAA. Through the 80s, it grew up to about 20 to 30 when we had the spare parts scandals and things like that, and then we had acquisition reform. In the 90s, we tried to pull back. When I was running the show, I was part of the problem because I generated good 40 to 50 acquisition provisions a year, and I thought I was being hands-off and giving discretion to the department and how they handled things and things like that, but that was in my handling of any individual provision. The total number of provisions dramatically increased. As I say, about 40, 50 when I was there. After I left, it went up to 80, 90, 100. That's just more than the department can reasonably digest. One of the impacts of that is that it limits the ability of senior officials to develop their own agendas because you're so busy chasing the ball on all these things Congress has told you to do that it makes it hard to develop your own focus. An piece of advice I would give to people who are in the department now and future people who will be in the leaders in the department is you may want to use that. If assuming that Congress isn't going to change its ways and NDAAs are still going to be packed with these provisions, you may want to use that as a tool for picking and choosing. So I can't necessarily pick things that are off the congressional agenda, but let me look at the 80 things that you've given me and choose the 3 or 4 that I think are the most important, where I can make the biggest difference, and focus my attention there rather than scattering it across the entire range of what you've given me. I mean, I have to wave my hands at every one of them. I have to do something on every one of them, but let me figure out where the ones are that I can really make a difference and focus on those.
Yeah, I mean, so back again to this theme of prioritizing and focusing effort, which I just think is so important. You know, and as we've been talking here, another underappreciated aspect of the dynamics of defense reform has kind of popped out for me, and that is that it's really an ongoing, continuous exercise. I think a lot of different folks, both on the Hill and in the department, undertake a reform effort, thinking that like the department is unreformed now and we're going to do this thing for 2 years and then it will be reformed and the project will be complete, right? Whereas there's always going to be ways that the department can improve in an efficiency and better management, and you know, really looking at it as like a never-ending, ongoing thing that you always have to be doing, as opposed to something that starts and then is finished. I think would really change the way, you know, certain folks, again, both the executive and legislative branches, think about reform.
Some people see that view as being discouraging. I actually think it's an optimistic view. It's my view too, Susanna. And the reason I think it's an optimistic view is because of that element that there are always things that we can do better. It's important to have good leaders and to have those leaders focused, because there are always things we can do better. That means that there are things that you can achieve in your term. Even if the problem as a whole is never going to be solved, there are improvements I can make. I can make a difference in my job. And I think that that's an optimistic attitude.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a cause for optimism as opposed to discouragement. I don't know, Bob, if you have thoughts on that.
I can't add much to what you and Peter have said on this. I mean, everybody in the department wants to, well, let me just say, and I think this is one of the questions that came up on the chat. A lot of this pressure for reform and efficiencies really is about chasing a budget bogey. So the first big efficiency drill that we did, or at least that I did, was under Secretary Bob Gates, where he said, look, we know we're going to be getting out of Iraq. We'll be getting out of Afghanistan as soon as we can. This will lead to a drop in the defense budget. So we have got to help ourselves. We have to become more efficient and divert money from what, this is the way he would say it, divert money from tail to tooth. So he said, each of the departments, I want you to find $40 billion in efficiencies over the 5-year defense program. And then every year after that, we got sequestration, we got more budget reductions. And the only way what was happening is the budget was just coming down. And so the mantra was become efficient. And somebody made a very, I think, good observation that generally what you want to do when you're going for efficiencies is improve the processes of the department. That's the goal, to improve the processes. But right now, defense reform really has been associated with saving money that you can divert back into the program because the budget has come down and there are too many requirements for the budgets that we have. So really, defense reform should be about reforming something, like Peter said, the Goldwater-Nichols Act and the WSARA, both of which were very, very important pieces of legislation and led to substantive, lasting change. But I think over the last 10 years, because of this crazy budget environment the department has been in, it really has just been about, hey, take the next cut and try to continue to do what you used to do with less money. I don't know, Peter, if you agree with that.
No, I agree with that. I think I hope that the effort for defense management reform goes on at the same time. I do worry that sometimes the budget cutting drill takes up so much energy that less senior bandwidth is left over for the true reforms. But I think that those budget cutting drills are important to have. I'd go to Secretary Esper's current look at the fourth estate. It's an effort to set priorities. Now, we may not necessarily agree with his priorities and everything that he wants to cut, but going through the budget in a detailed way that he's going through and setting priorities and saying these things are less important, and if I cut these, I can free up money to things I think are more important. That's part of the job of the Secretary of Defense. I do hope that that Bob's distinction there is not totally lost. Because we're doing that budget cut drill, we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of also doing reforms. And an area I would look to for that is healthcare, where we may see budget cut drills. How can we reduce the number of docs? Great, maybe you can, maybe you can't, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not. But cutting the number of doctors and saving money should not be a substitute for looking at the structure of the way we deliver healthcare in the department and the way we deliver a medically ready force and a ready medical force to the department, and figure out how we can make that delivery process more efficient, because it's an area where real management change and real structural change can make a difference, and a more enduring difference than just cutting budgets.
Yeah, so I'm just remembering, I've heard Bob Hale, former DoD comptroller, observe a couple times, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that there were a lot of cuts kind of masquerading as efficiencies for a while. And I do think the distinction between cutting the budget, which can be an important and valid exercise, and actually engaging in reform, it would serve the department well to be really clear about when it's doing which. Yeah. And so agree with you there. But speaking of the fourth estate, it's not escaped my notice that really, really often, defense reform efforts are very focused on the fourth estate, but that's less, over 80% of the DoD budget is not in the fourth estate, it's in the services. And so I wonder, Peter, what it was like for you both as DCMO and as a USD PNR, working with the services. Did they welcome your support and your input? If not, how did you work to bring them around? What was that experience like?
I think it's important to recognize, if you're working in the Office of Secretary of Defense, or if you're looking at the Department of Defense, the Department of Defense is a distributed enterprise. It's not a centrally run institution. Power is distributed, and in particular, it's distributed to the services. So if you're working in OSD, whether it's DCMO or PNR or ANS or R&E or another position, you're not the only power center. You have other power centers you need to work with. And it's important to work closely with those power centers to develop an understanding, to develop shared goals, and work in common with them, and not think that you're going to be in a position to direct them and tell them what to do. This is part of my argument that nobody takes orders. It's that the system works best if you're not trying to give orders, but you're trying to work with people. Because if the Army or the Navy is resistant to a position or a policy or a direction that's coming out of OSD from one of the undersecretaries, they may have a reason for that. And rather than trying to brute force your policy through or your position through, you're better off understanding what that reason is and working with the people who have the issue or the problem to address that and try to work in a common direction. In the book, I think I make the point about how people talk about the Pentagon bureaucracy or the Pentagon resistance to reform as the building has a voice, meaning sort of the institutions and all the different pillars in the building. And I say that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something you should work with rather than just ignoring or trying to overcome, because the reason the building has a voice is because all those different pillars represent important defense interests. And if you ignore them, then you're ignoring important defense interests. It's much better to work with them and understand them and try to develop common institutions. The way I come back around, as I say, that the building will be there a whole lot more than the officials will. So you better understand the building. So. That's my take on it anyway.
Absolutely. The building indoors for sure. I have I think probably our last question here before we go to the audience. And I'd like to hear from both of you on it. There's a lot of debate out there. Can DoD reform itself? Does it need help from outside? Does it need some kind of crisis in order to spur reform? Or can we remain optimistic that DoD can take steps absent a crisis, absent a directive from elsewhere, to get better at what it does?
So my view is good leaders in the Department of Defense can make change for the better. there are limits on how far they can go in that change. And the bigger the change, the more stimulus is required. So some changes of really significant magnitude probably do require a crisis or catalyzing event. Goldwater Nichols probably would not have been possible without the military failures that preceded it and led to the review of the Armed Services Committee that forced change on an initially unwilling department, and the department eventually came around. But without that catalyzing event, I don't think that a change of that magnitude would have been possible. So I'm optimistic in that I think good leaders can always make good changes, but I do believe that if the change is big enough, it's not likely to come without some crisis or catalyzing event to push it.
I generally agree with that view. I mean, the two examples that Peter uses in the book are both really good ones, and that's the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 and the Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act of 2009. That really required Congress to say, enough is enough. You know, you've studied this problem for a long time. You've told us you're going to fix it. You said, trust us, we're the experts. But at some point, Congress's patience wears thin, and they say, no, you are going to change. And so in some of these very big reforms, I really do believe that the department needs external stimulus. But I agree with Peter, there's a large number of things that are going on in the department that Congress didn't tell us to do. All you have to do is look at the US Air Force and its move to a digital service, the way they're doing digital engineering and things like that. These are going to be enormously consequential for the department over time. And, you know, the department, I mean, Congress didn't say, we want you to do digital thread. So it's a combination. I mean, this truly is a partnership between, I feel this very strongly. This truly is a partnership between the Department of Defense and Congress and the executive branch. And I do believe that over the last 10 years, Congress has moved beyond measured oversight and into micromanagement, you know, as indicated by the length of, the length of the NDAA and the amount of, you know, we want you to split AT&L, we want you to stand up a CMO. Oops, we fooled you. We don't really want you to stand up a CMO. I believe right now we're a little out of whack, that Congress became too, I'd be interested in Peter's view on this. It became too interested in management rather than oversight.
I think that's probably true. I have, in the book, I talk about the acquisition system and how they and how some of the problems we've had with acquisition are not due to bad people, but to a built-in set of incentives where the incentive to keep a program going is so important to the people who are closest to it that it's only natural that you get optimistic assessments and unrealistic projections of how well a program is going to do. Try to pull to sweep problems under the rug and that kind of thing. That's a set of incentives that are structural, and you can try to fight against them, but you have to acknowledge they're there. If you look at Congress and legislation, there's a set of structural incentives. The way that you show that you're an effective member of Congress or an effective staffer is you draft legislation. So you identify a problem and you draft legislation. It would be nice if Congress would go back to some of the feeling they had 30 years ago that you could be effective by holding a hearing. But I think that right now the idea of hearings is sort of downgraded, and they're viewed as not being terribly effective. Nobody's paying any attention. Puts much more weight on the legislation. The fact that the NDAA is one of the few pieces of legislation that still passed puts much more weight on the NDAA. So everybody wants to get a provision in it. And if everybody has to have a provision in it with 535 members of Congress, that's a lot of provisions. So I think there's a structural incentive to that, and it's going to be hard to overcome.
Susanna, could I ask Peter a quick question before we go to audience?
Sure.
Peter, I think a lot of people would say that the audit of the Defense Department is among the most important defense reforms of the last decade. What is your thought on that?
You know my position on that, because I'm about to be much more controversial than that. I think, first of all, it's not of the last decade. The audit was required 3 decades ago. And while we're a little bit better off today than we were when the requirement was enacted in the early 1990s, I'm not convinced that we're a whole lot closer to a clean audit than we were then. And so if you spend 30 years spending several $billions a year trying to address a problem and you're not that much closer to solving it, you ought to ask whether you're doing the right thing. In this case, to me, a financial statement for the Department of Defense is a relatively low priority. So I believe in auditing, but the audit, the getting a clean audit on a financial statement, to me, is not worth the amount of money that we're spending on it. If we're spending, the official estimate is about $1 billion a year we're spending on this effort. I look at when I was acting undersecretary for P&R, we have a mess in our personnel data. We're spending $1 billion on financial data. We have the Defense Manpower Data Center, which needs maybe $40 to $50 million a year to really clean up its act and give us good personnel data that we can act on. To me, that's a complete imbalance. We can spend $1 billion on something we don't really need, but we can't spend $40 to $50 million on something that will really improve the operation of the department. So I believe in better data. I believe in auditing, but I think we have overinvested and overcommitted to a single target in our single-minded pursuit of an auditable financial statement.
Well, on that controversial note, we'll go to the audience. Audience, please keep your questions coming using the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And please also remember to identify yourself. We've got some good questions in the queue already. I apologize if we don't get to all of them, but I'm going to start. We actually have a lot of friends of the panel on here, and I'll start with one of them, Steve Welby. Hi, Steve. He asks, many ideas for defense management reform start with the perspective that the latest practices used in commercial enterprises could or should be directly adopted by the department. The department does engage in business-like efforts, but has different goals, objectives, incentives than commercial enterprises. And can you talk a little bit about the challenges of mapping commercial business processes and expectations onto the Department of Defense?
Yeah, I particularly make this point in a section of the book about acquisition reform, because commercial practices do have a relevance to the Department of Defense. They're important for the department to consider, and they have a place. But we always have to be aware, be on our guard in an institution as big and complex as the department about one-size-fits-all solutions. So the experience of the 1990s, when we went to commercial practices to buy commercial items first, was a tremendous revolution for the department, giving the department much better access to commercial items, commercial technologies, saving the department probably billions of dollars by not requiring military unique development of things that could frankly be built better in the private sector. We went from commercial items to commercial-like items and dual-use items, and I think we did that successfully in the 1990s and really gained a lot from it. But then we tried to apply commercial practices to the acquisition of major weapon systems, and we hit a brick wall because they didn't really apply very well. And we ended up with a period of time when we really lost discipline in the acquisition of major weapon systems because we thought that we could just pull the rules off and do this the way the commercial sector does it, as if the commercial sector bought major weapon systems. And we ran into the kinds of dramatic overruns and problematic major acquisition programs that led later to WSARA and the effort to reimpose some discipline. That legislation didn't come out of nowhere. It came because we saw cost growth on the order of 60, 80, 100% across the entire portfolio of major weapons programs of the Department of Defense. It was just crowding out anything we could do. It was out of control, and it, in my view, was an outgrowth of the effort to apply commercial lessons where they didn't belong. I think there's real room for that, for pulling rules back and experimenting and trying new things, but we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be able to buy commercial things commercially. We need to be able to do R&D and prototyping with the try it fast, fail fast type of approach. And we still need to be able to have real discipline when we start spending billions of dollars of taxpayer money on major weapon systems. And so because the department isn't a single organization doing a single thing, but an incredibly complex organization trying to do many different things, very different things at the same time, we can't take one size fits all solutions.
I agree with that. There's a real good part in Peter's book. I just lost my train of thought. There are a lot of good parts. There are a lot of good parts in your book. But what I was going to say is Frank Kendall used to always talk about this, and I used to always chuckle when he said it. He said, look, he said, the key difference between us and the commercial sector is we have to be fair. And what he meant by that is you have to give everybody the opportunity to respond to the RFP and to make a bid. And that, that doesn't have to happen in the commercial space. And it really changes everything. The commercial sector doesn't have to worry about protests. All you have to do is look at JEDI and how long that has dragged out and has really kept the department from moving forward in cloud and AI technologies because of protests. So there are things, obviously, that you can bring in, commercial practices that are really good. I think we learned the hard way that commercial practices on software development were a decade ahead of what the department was doing in the old waterfall process. And we have started slowly adopting them, and now I think that's accelerated at an ever increasing pace. So there are definitely things you can learn from the commercial sector. I now remember what the point was. Peter describes the Department of Defense not as a business, but as an economy. And Peter, you can say this much better than me, but I just love this idea. We have our own real estate business. We have our own healthcare business. We have our own DHL and FedEx, the Defense Logistics Agency. We have just the astounding scale of the department is just beyond what I think most people really understand. In the commercial sector, what you do is you really try to focus on one or two things that you do really well and try to dominate the market in there. But we can't do that. We have to be as good in our real estate agency as we are in our healthcare agency, as we are in our defense logistics agency, as we are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think people should take Peter's observation here. It's the first time I had ever heard it, and it really resonated with me.
Thanks. And thanks, Steve, for that great question. I've got another one here from Bill Bender. And Bill, forgive me for paraphrasing a little bit here, but he says, as the Air Force's Chief Information Officer, he learned quickly to only focus on those challenges that were within his own sphere of influence, right? Anytime you try to do something that impacts more than just the entity that you're presiding over, you run into big delays and challenges working through the bureaucracy. And Bill is noting that this experience seems to contradict, Peter, a little bit your point on delegating leading to the lowest common denominator. And so I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit for us.
So I think it's good for a leader to focus on things that he or she can control within their scope. So I think, and I would like to see a leader also pick or choose maybe an issue or two, which requires working with others outside of their pillar in the hopes that maybe they can make that better. I think that there is a risk that we accept things as they are and say, well, this is a rotten system, but I just have to work with it. When if a few people would pop their heads up and say, this is a rotten system, maybe we don't have to work with it, maybe they could improve it. One of the things that I have noticed when I came to the department, and perhaps even more so now that I'm on the outside, is people tend to accept to take law as a given immutable thing. They say, well, we can't do anything about that. That's the law. Now, having worked on Capitol Hill and written, as we've just discussed, too many pieces of legislation over the years, I fundamentally don't have that attitude. If it's the law, I say, well, but okay, it's the law. Is it right? If it isn't right, then we should think about whether we should change it. So you don't want to take on too much. So focusing on the things you can control is well advised. But if there's something that's a little bit outside of your range and you need to work with one or two other people to solve it, depends how big of an irritant it is. It may be worth working with those one or two other people and working across pillars and trying to solve the problem.
Hey, Susanna, I saw one question that I'd really like to address as quickly as I can. It comes from Steve Hedger. How you doing, Steve? You know, he's talking about, is the fourth estate really as bloated as everyone thinks? And this used to drive me crazy. There is no such thing as the fourth estate. The correct term is defense-wide spending. And it's just all the spending of the department that isn't allocated to the military departments or MILDEPs, the Department of the Air Force, Department of the Army, and the Department of the Navy. Now, in defense-wide spending, there's the entire Defense Health Program. That's like $44 billion a year. There's the Special Operations Command. There's the Missile Defense Agency. All of the combat support agencies that support our combatant commanders.
The combatant commands.
And the combatant commanders are in this. So what we did is Congress said, how many people are in management overhead positions? And Peter actually led this effort. For the first time, the department said, okay, how many people are in management positions? So we counted the people on the joint staff and the OSD staff. We went to all the combatant commanders and we said, who on your staff is really doing management oversight rather than combatant commander operational business? And Peter, you might know the numbers. These are the numbers that kind of stuck in my head. You know, it turned out that about 1.6 or 7% of the entire department is in management overhead. And the only benchmark that we had was a study made in the early 2000s, which said Fortune 500 companies had like about 1.5 to 2% of their entire structure in management overhead. So we were saying, damn, that's pretty good because we're such a diversified economy, as Peter said. So when people think that the fourth estate is this big bloated, you know, just people sitting around eating donuts and, you know, not doing anything productive, it's just not true. In fact, almost every single organization in the fourth estate, when sequestration was triggered, they were given the sequestration cap targets. And that was it. They said, this is where you stay. So even though Congress was giving us more money each year that was a little slightly above the sequestration caps, all of the management headquarters and stuff had to eat those cuts. So I'm sorry to get on my soapbox. I'm glad Steve asked the question, but I just wanted to assure the listeners, that the fourth estate is not just this big, you know, big piece of bloated overhead. Sorry.
No, it's a great point and appreciate the question, Stephen. Thank you, Bob, for the answer. We're almost out of time, but I want to sneak one more question in. This one from Scott Combs, actually, and he says, the department keeps relearning the same lessons. What recommendations do you have for making these lessons stick even when administrations change?
So first, thank you, Scott, for that question. It's good to hear from you. And it's the perfect question to end on because it takes me back to my book. The real answer is read my book so you get some of those lessons and you won't have to relearn them from scratch. But it will always be a problem that because of the way that we turn over leadership, that the department will be learning lessons over again. It's not necessarily a bad thing because you also bring in fresh talent and fresh views, and you also refresh the department at the same time that you're learning lessons over again. So yes, buy my book, but don't be so pessimistic that learning lessons over again is always a bad thing.
I can't add to that, Susanna.
All right, great. Well, you're right. That's a great note to end on. Karen, Alan, Patrick, I'm so sorry we didn't get to your questions, but we're out of time. Peter, I just want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing all this wisdom. And Bob, likewise, really appreciate it. I know our audience got a lot out of it. I always learn something when I talk to the two of you. So thank you so much for being here today.
And thank you, Susanna. It's wonderful. You did a
Susanna.
great job of this.
Great
Thanks.
to be here.